Anna, thank you for joining me today.
Hello.
Hiya. I've introduced you to everyone and give them a little bit of a background on you, but um, obviously I asked you on today because you've been diagnosed as a celiac, and we've spoken quite a few times, and I thought you'd make a great guest because you have a huge amount of knowledge. And I know you're very keen to share that knowledge. So I'd like to start really with just talking through your journey through celiac. So how old were you when you were properly diagnosed? And we'll come back to that a little bit, but when you were actually properly diagnosed?
So yeah, hello and thank you for having me. Yeah, I was actually about 25, 26 whilst I was going through the diagnosis with my celiac disease. And at that age, it's quite a shock really to be told that you can't eat certain things. Um, it wasn't a straightforward journey as well. It did take quite a long time to get diagnosed. And I'm a great believer actually that I, I was actually celiac as a child, but it was just misdiagnosed. And unfortunately, my symptoms I was displaying weren't kind of listened to in a way. And I think, that's not to say that doctors haven't done a good job. I just think it's very difficult for them. And I'll explain, obviously, and go into that more later. Um, but yeah, it was quite life changing for me, being that age, having a new job, and all of a sudden getting quite ill and having all of these symptoms.
Yeah, and I think that it's key to. I think I just want to come back to what you were saying, and actually, yeah, you are born with celiac disease. I heard about a case not so long ago where so inherited, and it's an autoimmune disease, and so for the listeners, that is not for you, Anna. And I heard of a case quite recently where a baby had got quite severe celiac disease, and then actually the baby's granddad, who was sort of, I don't know exact age, but 60s, 70s, was then actually diagnosed with celiac, which is obviously sort of less severe, but suddenly down the family they were going, oh, that's what it is. And so I think it's very key
Yeah.
to say that you know diagnosis is key. Do you think, I think we are, do you think we're getting or the medical profession are becoming more aware of it, that perhaps 30, 40 years ago they didn't know it quite so, understand
Yeah.
it quite so well?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, it certainly runs in the family. My brother is a celiac. My sister struggles with gluten. My 10-year-old nephew now is gluten-free. My mum's also gluten-free. So it certainly runs in my family. And yeah, I think obviously there's a lot more research as well that's gone into it. Obviously, you've got Coeliac UK and different bodies now in different countries that are obviously researching. And it has become quite a well-known thing. You go into lots of restaurants now, as you know, and there's loads more gluten-free things available, which is really good because then that makes people kind of think, oh, okay, and people do say it's a bit of a fad, but it's good for people to know that is an issue because then people will consider it. Um, Doctors definitely have got better. There's an awful lot more people talking about it now. So that really sorry, I can't get the words
Get
out.
your words out. Where raises the
Raises
profile.
awareness, certainly. It really, really does, which is fantastic from my point of view because it helps me to get my message across as well. And there's a few different theories. I think it's still quite early on in really fully understanding kind of where celiac disease has come from and the issues with gluten. And the theories kind of range from, or how come people were not diagnosed with it kind of hundreds of years ago, people didn't have a problem with it, but we don't kind of know that. Unless if we went back in time and kind of tested people then, because people might have had symptoms but not been aware of it.
Absolutely, we didn't have the technology to be able to diagnose. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I would
Yeah.
totally poo-poo on that, and especially from in my learning while I'm training to be a naturopath, one of the key things that we're taught is that one of the sort of the indicators is we should also look out for obviously other family members, which you mentioned, but also
Yeah.
it's of the same family as rheumatoid arthritis because it's an autoimmune
Yeah.
disease. So if anyone in the family has got rheumatoid arthritis, that can be you are more likely to have celiac disease, and that's a different, totally different thing, and it is connected in that way that it's an autoimmune. So yeah, I agree. Just because we didn't have the technology to understand the disease then, it doesn't mean it wasn't around. I think it's becoming, we're understanding it more, and I think possibly it's becoming more prevalent because of the way our food is produced.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's part of the issue, is we are eating probably more wheat, and perhaps not of such a good quality, and so that's bringing issues. So how did you so what were your, obviously looking back you can now think that your symptoms were there, so you've had symptoms your whole life then, really, haven't you?
Pretty much, and they did kind of come and go. I mean, I remember going to the doctors when I was about 13, 14 and just saying, there is something not right. I didn't know what, I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt very anxious, just for kind of no reason, really. And then I just thought, well, that's just me as a person. I'd get these periods where I would just sit and cry for no reason. And again, you just think, oh, for goodness sakes, I'm just an emotional person, and, maybe it's hormones, and that it almost seemed like there was an answer for everything, and, I'd go and say, but I feel really tired. I don't feel with it most of the time. Oh, wow, you're a growing girl, and, you've got school and the stresses of that. And actually, those actual symptoms weren't looked at. It like I say, it was just almost like there was an excuse for everything. Yeah. And again, not to say that the doctors didn't do a good job then, because obviously we're talking quite a few years ago. And again, celiac disease wasn't that well known even back then, really, even kind of 15, 20 years ago. So, I was still able to live fine. I was still classed as a happy, healthy child. I was very active. I had quite a lot of energy. It was just the occasional time where I just wouldn't quite feel great, but I couldn't put my finger on it. So again, that is where things like celiac disease, I think, are very difficult to diagnose, because I was still out. I used to do cross-country running. I had my horses. To anybody looking on the outside, I was a very healthy child.
Yeah, and this is the problem, isn't it? It's because the longer it takes to diagnose, the more damage is done. So now we know that the gut and the brain is connected, and if our gut health isn't good, then we're not producing the right hormones. So it was hormone related in a way, because you're not producing the right amount of serotonin. And then, of course, like you said, you, from the outside, you look fine, and you didn't have really severe symptoms, but constantly this damage is happening in your gut lining. And then, of course, eventually it flared up in your mid-20s. So just explaining to the listeners sort of how, what happened for you to finally get the diagnosis. What were the symptoms like, and the processes that they went through to finally diagnose you?
Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, I started a new job. And that was shift work, so it was quite demanding. And I'll be the first to put my hand up and be honest and say I wasn't the healthiest of people, because I was skinny and I could get away with eating what I wanted, basically. And I love junk food. That's terrible to think now, but I did. So I wasn't eating the best, and I honestly think because I wasn't eating regularly, and I was eating a lot of sweets, a lot of pizza, a lot of rubbish, that actually really kind of brought the symptoms on, and my body just got to a point where it just couldn't cope anymore. So very quickly, I'd gone from feeling a bit lethargic, but I was okay, to sleeping 16 hours a day and not being able to get up. I had horrendous bloating, and it was distension bloating as well. So that's where, especially with women, your stomach, you just look heavily pregnant. Yeah. Like I say, I was very skinny as well, so I couldn't really put weight on. So I just thought I was lucky with that, but actually my body wasn't absorbing anything, so that's why I was skinny. And it was one day in particular, I went to work and I actually had to go home sick because my stomach hurt so horrendously I couldn't stand up straight. and, you know, my trousers wouldn't fit. So I had to buy elasticated waist trousers. And that day it really dawned on me that actually something horrendous was going on inside. So I went home and I went to the doctors feeling rather nauseous and quite concerned and worried, obviously. And the doctor was really lovely, actually. She really listened to me. She could tell I was in quite a lot of pain and discomfort. And she thought I had IBS. And she was quite adamant it's going to be IBS, even though I didn't have any kind of symptoms with diarrhea or anything like that. So that's where I was really lucky, because the blood test for celiac disease is actually, it was within the batch of blood tests for IBS. So actually, in a way, I actually got diagnosed kind of by accident.
Wow.
So I had the blood test that obviously came back positive for celiac disease. And that's where it all started, really.
I was getting quite frustrated when you said, "Oh, the doctor was saying it was IBS." I was kind of like, you know, I was like, "Oh gosh, not another," because it's just like a generic term that she used for me. My unhappiness about the term IBS is it's almost like, oh, it's just IBS and then it's forgotten.
Yeah.
So, but actually, she did do some tests, so that was quite positive then, really. Because if she hadn't have done, yeah, who knows where you would have been now. So once they'd I'm going to come back to the diagnosis, but I just want to talk a little bit about what you were saying about how you were feeling, and I think it's really key for people to understand that the symptoms don't have to be really severe early on, do they? Like, yours were obviously very bad, but the problem obviously was happening that the damage was slowly getting worse and worse. And I think one of the key things is when you said you were quite slim and you could eat what you wanted, but you weren't absorbing it. And people don't really understand that. So do you want to explain a little bit about you kind of the health of your gut? Because I know you're quite an expert on this. So go.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Because again, like you say, when you can get away with eating what you want, you don't think about what you're actually feeding your body and what your body needs. So with celiac disease, what happens is the little villi, so the little almost like fingers that are obviously inside your gut, they are like little fingers because they have a lot of surface area, so they can obviously absorb what your body needs, so all your nutrients and everything. So that obviously is fueling your body. So what happens with celiac disease is they can actually get damaged, the lining can get damaged, and in severe cases like myself, those little villi, those little fingers actually start to lie flat. So as you can imagine, you're losing a massive amount of surface area there. So you can eat the best ever, but if your body's not going to be absorbing it, you are going to have almost the energy levels of a starving person. It's going to be equivalent to you not having any meals, not having any kind of nutrition. So obviously with that, things like my nails started to really suffer, my hair was falling out. That's where I became lethargic. I was skinny because I wasn't absorbing anything. So it got to a point where my body just really was not working correctly. And also I found that after the diagnosis with the celiac disease, I was tested again to see that my villi were more healthy, which they were. But my microbiome was obviously pretty destroyed as well, because all those little enzymes and the whole kind of ecosystem of your gut was just completely out of balance, because certain things just couldn't thrive in my gut. And I know that now. I obviously didn't know that at the time. It's taken quite a long time, and I can tell now that my gut is more healthy because things like my nails have started to grow and I feel so much better and my skin is better. But it's those kind of things you don't really consider really when you are eating things, and that's why it is so important, obviously, as you know, for your nutrition. Because then it's other problems like dairy. So I can't digest dairy because my lactase enzymes have basically been destroyed. So it's trying to get that ecosystem back to good health so that then you can digest things that you might not have been able to before. and actually get your body healthy again.
Exactly, and that's the challenge, isn't it? That exactly, and that's the challenge, isn't it? That you were malnourished without realizing it, because you were eating, and you could have you said yourself, maybe your diet wasn't brilliant. You could have been eating the best diet in the world, and because of that damage to your gut lining. And it's a very, very common thing for celiacs to have other like issues with dairy and things, because like you said, you've lost all that all that gut biome, and all that strength. Your gut has been compromised, and it's weak. I think that's the only way to describe it, really, isn't it? It's weak. So yeah, I mean, I think it's great to hear that you're on the road to recovery, and obviously the long-term hope is that you can eventually eat dairy and so and so on, because we can rebuild that. But what you understand, and I think this is perhaps what some people miss, is actually it's a long journey. You've got to be really respectful, haven't you, and take your time. So I just want to pop you back to when you were talking about the diagnosis. So you're in your mid-20s, and suddenly the doctors say to you, you've got celiac disease, you can't eat wheat, that's it, and it's not an intolerance, let's be clear. It's not a case of you might feel a bit iffy. This is your body reacting against itself if you have wheat. So how did they give you much advice for this? Was there much help for you?
Not really, and I think that's where I really struggled. Is I did have some kind of idea, at least. I was lucky in the fact that my brother actually was diagnosed with ME, so he was extremely ill with that, and he found that gluten was a big issue for him. So that, I think, is really interesting as well. So he was never officially diagnosed with celiac disease, but he was on a gluten-free diet. So that really helped me, because I could speak to him straight away. I knew roughly what kind of foods I could eat. But even with that, I still really struggled. And I think the main issue for me was not really knowing anybody else other than my brother, and not being part of any kind of community. So the doctors didn't really have anywhere they could signpost me to necessarily. I was given a dietitian to speak to, but you only kind of get one session a year with them, and you get a pack that kind of says don't eat gluten, a bullet point with things that might have gluten in, a little bit of information about prescriptions for breads, gluten-free bread. I really don't like gluten-free bread anyway, so that didn't really help me. And that was it, really. I got a leaflet for Coeliac UK, so I had a look on their website and different things. They have some really useful help and advice on there as well, and lots of recipes. So I just kind of felt like I was almost just kind of a rock that had been thrown into a lake and just left.
Yeah, and I think that's really common. I think that's such a shame. So we planned this interview a little while ago, but actually you were working on a project that we weren't sure if we were going to talk about today, but I'm really pleased that we can. So I'm going to pop back to gluten-free stuff in a little bit, but because I think this is the appropriate time, I'd really like you to explain kind of how that journey led you to being on your own. Let's talk about the new business that you're planning. And I know it's still early days, but this was really, that's what drove you to set up Coeliac Lifestyle, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. I love being a positive person, and it was a really difficult time in my life, to be honest, because I had horrendous lingering symptoms after actually going gluten-free and being diagnosed. But it's taught me so much about my body and myself. And I got to a point where I felt that I'd lost quite a few years of my life just from not knowing simple things, like about the microbiome and, dairy being a problem and things like that. So with that in mind, I really didn't want anybody else to be in the same position that I was. So I decided that it was going to be my mission to support people and help people, whether that's with celiac disease or whether it's just that they have issues with gluten. So my mission is to set up my own business, which is called the Coeliac Lifestyle. Like you say, it's still in the infancy at the moment, but I'm really excited about creating my membership. So that is just a space for people where they can come, they can pay a monthly subscription, which isn't too expensive, and it's a really positive, supportive community for anybody with any issue with gluten. So they can learn from me, we can learn from each other, get guest experts on like yourself, to talk about kind of different aspects of being gluten-free, because there's so many different elements to a gluten-free lifestyle. You know, things like the mindset, nutrition, just day-to-day living in the household. There's so many different things. So that's why I've set up this hub that will be launching soon. So yes, I've got my Facebook page at the Coeliac Lifestyle, and I'll be doing my membership soon, and I'll be launching that hopefully in the new year.
Brilliant. Well, this episode should go out about the same time as so we're obviously pre-recording this, so it should go out about the same time as you launch. So we'll definitely put all the links in there. And I think it's great because I think, you know, the thing is it's about the support, and just having that resource for people is really important, and understanding, you know, having somewhere to go. Is this normal, you know, and what can I expect? And, you know, I'm feeling like that this is expected. And I think that's having that community is really, really important. And I just want to touch on gluten-free products, because we spoke about that a little bit. You just said you don't like gluten-free bread. So I have a bit of an issue, and I'm doing the inverted commas issue with things that are free from, because I just believe that there's so many alternatives. So why would you want to eat really horrible gluten-free bread when actually there are some great things in that just don't contain gluten? So going from kind of like, let's say before you found out you were celiac, you might have cereal for breakfast, you might have a sandwich for lunch, and then you might have pizza for tea. Let's pick some 3 really difficult things to do. What do you now do that's different to that, and what kind of tips could you give some of the listeners if they're quite, you know, if they're recently diagnosed or having issues with gluten?
Okay, so obviously I'm trying to help my body and help my microbiome in my gut. So with that, I've actually cut out cereal, because I used to love cereal. But like you say, a lot of the free from products, you've got to be careful, because they contain actually a lot of things like sugar, and they're actually not that good for you. So I try not to buy too many products actually directly off the shelf that are free from. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love a naughty treat, but I try and be as good as I can. So yeah, for breakfast I've changed things. So, you know, I eat a lot more fruit now, so things like bananas. I'm not great with porridge oats, so that's something I try to avoid, just because that can go hand in hand as well with issues with gluten.
Yeah, and I should just say that you can get porridge oats that are gluten. So porridge oats do not have gluten in them, but they're often processed in the factories where other items with gluten is. And so if you're wheat intolerant, it won't cause you an issue. But if you are celiac, you just cannot have any wheat at all, can you? There's no kind of messing about it. It's like an allergy. So, you know, it's the same as allergy. So therefore, you have to be really careful about picking the porridge that has that's been processed in a gluten-free environment.
Absolutely.
There's only a few of those, isn't there? So
and it's things like that you do have to be careful about. But then again, as well, some people can't tolerate oats anyway, because they have something called avenine in them, which is very similar to gluten, and unfortunately my body thinks it's gluten, so I can't eat that. So yeah, it's just experimenting really. I mean, I don't mind the gluten-free bread if it's toasted, so I'll have, you know, kind of poached eggs on toast with avocado, things like that. So it's trying to get some goodness in there as well. Because now my mindset about food is very much, is this meal going to help my body? Or even if it's something a bit naughty, I'll add something in to make sure that it kind of balances. a little bit, you know, if I have something naughty, I'll like, make sure I eat really good in the day. So
That's
things
brilliant.
like
That's
that,
what my
really.
whole, that's
Yeah.
brilliant, because that's exactly, that's kind of exactly what my whole Ditch the Diet membership about. And I should
Yeah,
say here that Anna is actually a member of the Ditch the Diet as
I
well.
am. Yeah.
And that is our mindset, isn't it? At the end of the day, it's not
Yeah.
about not having treats, and it's not about saying you can't have something, but thinking, you know, is this feeding my body? Is this doing me good? Or, you know, I always say to people, if you're hungry, don't have chocolate. But if you want chocolate, have it, but just make sure you're not having it for, you know, have proper food,
No,
and then have chocolate as a treat. You know, we all want a treat, but don't have it
absolutely.
instead of eating.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, like you said earlier, there's so many more products now that are gluten-free. So, you know, if I did want a pizza, I'm actually going to have a pizza tonight, which is a bit naughty. But I have been really good this week. But yeah, so gluten-free pizza that is from Tesco's. You know, that there's lots of different supermarkets that stock, you know, kind of different things, because they acknowledge now that people are really missing certain foods. So they're really good now, because the gluten-free market is getting so much bigger. So they're constantly trying to fight each other for competition for different things. So like there's cinnamon rolls that have just come out, like the cinnamon buns. So of course people
Wow.
are going crazy for those, because it's things like that you miss. But yeah, so for lunch, you know, it could be an omelette with a drizzle of a really good drizzle of extra virgin olive oil. So that's a good fat, again, for your gut. Might be a bit of avocado sprinkled in there, some onions, just things like that, really. So I'm actually eating to fill myself up, but also thinking about my gut as well. And from doing that, and obviously from being within the group as well, it makes me think about that even more. So it's good then, because I know that I'm fueling my body.
Yeah, and that's what it's about, isn't it? It's fueling it. And I think,
Yeah.
you know, we've all been through the stages where we're not eating the best, and but obviously you have to be a lot more respectful of your body than maybe we have. And you know, I think it's really important what you were saying about the fact that some gluten-free products are just as in free from, which is why I have an issue
Yeah.
with lots of free from products, is that there's generally, if it's free from something, the food industry has to put something in to make it taste nice, and
Yeah.
it's normally not the best things that it puts in. So it's just about reading the labels, really, isn't it? And you know, and creating that balance. If you really want pizza, well, have pizza, but eat better during the day to counterbalance whatever, you know, if there's extra sugar in it that wouldn't normally be in there, then you can kind of counterbalance it a bit, can't you?
Absolutely. Or there's, you know, there's some really good Facebook groups out there as well that have loads of different recipes, and even on Instagram as well, for gluten-free foods. So, you know, if you want a pizza, I've done it before where I've got a gluten-free wrap, you know, made my own tomato sauce. Obviously I've said I struggle with lactose and dairy. So sprinkle some lactose-free cheese on the top, put a few different toppings on there, can put, you know, onions, different veg, things like that on. So then, yeah, it's not going to be a Domino's pizza, but you can adapt, you know, to make it a little bit better. So then you still feel like you're having something, but it's just adapting, isn't it? And just thinking about those food choices.
Yeah, and I think like you said, it's about mindset. I think that's really important, that instead of sitting there thinking, oh, I can't have, it's like, well, actually, you know, I'm enjoying this is the best I can have, and this is doing, you know, this is not harming me, and actually it's doing me good. And I think that's what I like about, you know, that's what I love about you, is you, like you said, you are a positive person, and it's remaining positive through it, isn't it, rather than, oh, woe is me.
Yeah, definitely. And touching on the mindset there, because you've just mentioned that, you know, it would be quite easy for me to kind of wallow in my own self-pity, really, especially when I was really ill. But I was so determined to make myself feel better. And I think, looking back on everything I've learned about myself, this might sound crazy, but I'm actually really glad that I went through that hard time and that I was diagnosed with celiac disease, because it means that I now have the ability to help other people. I've learned that actually I'm a very determined person, and also it's taught me a lot of discipline, because it's so easy to go, oh, I'll just have, a cookie, or I'll just have this, I'll just have that. From the start, as soon as I was diagnosed, I said, absolutely no, I am not having a single thing. And to this day, I can say that I'm really proud that I have not knowingly eaten anything containing gluten. I know I have, unfortunately, unintentionally eaten stuff that's got a bit of gluten in it because I've been ill after. But, it's really good to have that discipline as well. And I think sometimes that's what people lack when they are diagnosed with celiac disease. Or, like you say, people think that they just have maybe an intolerance to it, so they'll still have bits. But actually, cut it out completely, because actually your symptoms can be worse from actually having an intolerance. So it's just about kind of being wary of the signs and listening to your body, because if you're not feeling very good, but you're eating bits of gluten, that's not going to do you any good. So you've just got to listen to those signs and listen to your body as well.
Totally. And I think, the two things from that is, the journey has made you the person you are now. And, you're a really exciting time of your life where, the new business venture, it's here, it's launching, it's happening. And you would never have been there if it wasn't. So, from a negative becomes a positive. But I love what you're saying about, if you've got an intolerance, whether it's celiac or whether it's an intolerance, just don't eat it. I say this to people, and I'll work with clients and help them create, sort of diet plans and stuff. And I'll spend weeks encouraging them. And then sometimes I just get really cross with them and like, right, this is what you're eating. And I give them like a 7-day, it's not my style, as you know, but I'll give them like a 7-day meal plan. Say, right, do not deviate from this. And by day 5, they're messaging me going, oh my God, I feel great. And you're like, oh, Eureka. But it is about that, actually, I think we forget what it feels like to feel well. And that's the hard part, is getting past that, forgetting about the denial and feeling sorry for yourself, cutting something out that's doing you no good, and you feel better. And actually, when you feel better, then it's the reminder, isn't it? And it's like, actually, this is how I should feel all the time. And it's not worth that Domino's pizza. It's just not worth it, is it? It's silly. The amount of damage it is causing your body. So I wanted to just briefly ask you about, you said there's been times when you have accidentally eaten gluten. So a similar thing happened to a friend of mine. I think we had a bit of a Facebook conversation about this, where a friend of mine, she's not been diagnosed as celiac, but she has severe issues with gluten. She has issues with other things as well, and she's got fibromyalgia, and that's often a kind of people with fibromyalgia often have food intolerances. And I'd ordered the same thing as her, and it had an option of gluten-free bread, and she didn't ask for gluten-free, and she was halfway through eating it, and I looked at it and went, that's the same burger, like the same bun as mine. And she's like, oh God, I thought it said it was gluten-free. And I'm like, I don't think so. And we realised that it was just an option. It wasn't the actual, I'd read it as an option and she just thought it was in it. So that's happened to you as well, hasn't it? So I think the key is to be really cautious.
Definitely. Literally the exact same has happened to me. Even when I've asked for the gluten-free option, they've accidentally given me the normal gluten-filled option. So it's just been really wary, and like you say, actually checking what is on everyone else's plate, because I've gone and had a burger, they've even stuck a free from flag in the top of it, and then I've looked at my husband and said, hang on a minute, your burger looks exactly the same as mine. Unfortunately, people are human, we all make mistakes, and that's a pretty big mistake. However, I know it sounds terrible, you can't rely and trust everybody. Restaurants, places are getting better, but I think if people don't know someone that has a problem with gluten or with allergies, they don't tend to fully understand or kind of consider the implications of it. So I'm a nightmare when I go out. I always make sure that I say to the waitress, the waiter, this is the gluten-free option, isn't it? As long as it's gluten-free, and I repeat it, because other waitresses and other waiters have actually noticed when stuff's been given to me that isn't gluten-free, and they've come straight over. So it's just about being a little bit annoying and just keep saying and reaffirming the fact this is gluten-free, isn't it? And, you know, sometimes, yes, you will come home and be ill, unfortunately. And it's difficult because it's not like, you know, a mega big, I don't know, say, for instance, like a mega big rash on your arm, or that you've got a broken arm. So it's not obvious whether you've been glutened or not.
Glutened.
That is a term that's quite often used, gluten. However, you can assume and kind of look back and almost work out, well, where have I eaten, what have I eaten? Yeah, and you kind of get used to checking for the symptoms and, like I say, listening to your body. And you soon kind of get to know whether you have accidentally had something or not. I mean, however, though, I'm a firm believer that, yes, I've had a few instances where it has put me off, but I'm determined it's not going to put me off, because so many places are really, really good and they cater so well. So it's just finding places that you can trust, and that you can go knowing that actually you'll be okay.
Yeah, and I think you know, well done for you for saying, you know, I'm going to keep trying. And I think you're right. And I think part of from my personal point of view, I think part of the problem is, you know, some people say that they're gluten intolerant or they can't have gluten, and actually they're not really. They're just, you know, they just don't want, you know, they think that by having gluten-free, it's a better option. I know a lot of people who've said to me, oh, I've gone gluten-free and I've bought that gluten-free bread. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, are you celiac? Have you got an intolerance? Like, no, but it's better, isn't it? And you're like, no, it isn't. And this is part of the problem, that, you know, if restaurants are, you know, if the waiting staff aren't trained properly, and also as a consumer, if we're sort of saying, oh, can I have the gluten-free option just because you think it's a healthier option, which, as we, you know, stated earlier in the podcast, sometimes it's a less healthy option than bread, so that people need to be aware of that. But also, if people haven't got celiac disease and they're ordering, you know, a gluten-free option, it doesn't really matter if they get bread, but it really matters to you, doesn't it? It just has to be in the seasoning on, you know, I mean, chips with seasoning on them, when you get like sort of like southern fried seasoning, they can have flour in them. You can't even have that. And I think it's about the training, so people understand that it's not a fad. You're not just saying, oh, I'm off gluten this week, you can't have it. I think the more people understand that, then the better the service is going to be, because they're going to understand the message, really, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like you say, you know, in the seasoning or flour, it's in so many things. But another thing as well that people don't consider, and which I didn't necessarily consider when I was first diagnosed as a celiac, is actually the cross-contamination. So, you know, chips can be gluten-free, and quite often as well in places, in restaurants, they'll be advertised as gluten-free. But I always ask, do you use a separate fryer just specifically for everything that's gluten-free? And that's a really important point, because cross-contamination is a bit of a nightmare. It's very difficult for a kitchen. And I think you've always got to expect the possibility of cross-contamination. But it's difficult as well to work out how sensitive you are to gluten. So if you're still having things like chips that are put in the same fryer as, say, fish that's in batter, and you're still feeling ill, that could be potentially why. So it's just considering things like that. And again, in the household, you know, things like your knives and your knife block. If you're diagnosed with celiac disease one day, but the day before you're using knives, putting them into the knife block and cutting lovely crusty bread, those crumbs are going to be in there. So it is difficult to consider everything and eradicate all gluten from your life. But it's a learning curve, and that's something that, unfortunately, you know, you've got to kind of learn and get used to. But, you know, it's little kind of changes and things like that you have to consider to just make sure that you are healthy, and that you're getting the least amount of gluten as possible.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think, you know, as you said, you know, once you're on that journey and you can you can eliminate gluten, then the odd tiny bit of cross-contamination probably isn't going to bother you. But at the beginning of your journey, I suppose you have to be so fastidious. Like you said, the gut health, you've got to rebuild some of that health, and the more damaged it is, the more you're going to feel it, aren't you? It's not that you don't get the reaction, it's just that I suppose it's a bit like trying to explain it. Maybe it's like a cold. It's like if you really, really run down and you get a cold virus, it ends up being the flu. But actually, if you're quite robust, you might just, you might be able to shake it off. And it's a bit like that, isn't it? I know it's not a perfect analogy, but to try and explain it to some of the listeners, I think that's not a bad description.
Yeah,
bad
absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And you never entirely know how much damage is really caused. And obviously saying about the diagnosis, obviously you have the blood test, but I think a really important point I'd like to make on the podcast actually for listeners is that only 2 years before I was diagnosed with pretty severe celiac disease, I was at the top of the scale in severity, is that I was actually tested. I had the blood test 2 years before for celiac disease and it came back negative.
Oh, wow, okay.
Which is interesting, and I've heard a lot of people that I've spoken to have actually been in the same boat as me.
Wow.
So it really is a difficult thing to diagnose people, and I believe strongly that is why so many people are undiagnosed and they don't realise. So like you've said about an intolerance, some people think, oh, I've just got an intolerance to gluten. They try and come off gluten, it makes them feel a bit better, but they still eat bits and bobs. Well, that could have been me a few years ago, and I could still be causing damage to my gut right now. So it's just about being really careful. I would never turn around to anybody and kind of say, oh, you have to be gluten-free because you've got problems with gluten. I just like to give the information, people can make their own decision on that. But from what I've learnt, I would just be very careful if you do have problems with gluten, if you do think it's an intolerance, because the diagnosis really, it is tricky. Because
that's quite worrying. Yeah, that is worrying.
It is, and that's obviously something that's still really being developed at the moment. It's still not great, but it is getting better. And a lot of people as well with the genetic side of things as well that I've spoken to, that it might be that their parents are maybe diagnosed with celiac disease. So in quite a few countries that allows you to be tested as well. Straight away for celiac disease. So people will have the blood test, it comes back negative to show that they don't have it. However, they have the endoscopies, they have the camera down into the stomach, have a look, and they get diagnosed with celiac disease.
So I think the thing there is to just say to keep persevering with it. And I think maybe the kind of the generic IBS is almost keep insisting on having on those blood tests, or request it again. That is quite from my point of view, that's quite worrying, because I believed that it was a genetic SNP, and so you could get tested for it. So that's very worrying that you actually got tested and then and it came back. So keep going with it, I think is the key, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Any other tips for people if they suspect? So obviously, if people do have celiac disease, we'll signpost them to your website, to your Facebook page, and we'll also signpost them to Coeliac Life, because you said there's quite a lot of, sorry, not Coeliac Life, the Coeliac UK website. Yours is Coeliac Life. Excuse me, getting confused myself. But is there any other tips that you have for people if they suspect but haven't had a diagnosis, or have had a negative diagnosis, go back again? But if they've never had a diagnosis, is there anything that you can sort of suggest, any key signs that can help them? Because I know sometimes doctors are a little bit resistant to doing blood tests. So is there anything that you can advise them, any things that they can say, or anything that they really need to look out for?
Okay, I think actually writing it down is a really good start. So I would suggest to actually keep eating gluten. If you're at a stage where you are still eating gluten and you think you might have a problem with it, it sounds crazy, but I would actually advise to continue to eat gluten. And there's several reasons for that. One is that obviously if you go and have a blood test and you haven't eaten gluten in quite a while, the antibodies, it might not react. So that might actually give a false result. Also with the endoscopy as well, you have to continue to eat gluten to show that you've actually got the damage there to be diagnosed with celiac disease. So a doctor will always advise that you have to continue to eat gluten to have the endoscopy. I've spoken to a lot of people as well where they find it really difficult, where they've come off gluten, they feel a lot better, but then their doctor advises them to eat gluten again. That's really difficult for them to then eat something that they know is going to make them ill. And people say as well that they've actually felt more ill from stopping eating gluten and then having to go back on it to then be tested. So I would say keep eating gluten and actually do a food diary as well, because from experience, I found that actually foods that I craved were actually things that were a problem for me. And I've heard a lot of people say this. So I craved pasta. I love the pasta, you know, like the ravioli kind of style pasta with like the fillings in. So it was all dairy and it was all gluten. So do a food diary, and actually it could be things even 3 days before that you've eaten that could be causing you problems. So that's another thing I'd advise. If you go to your doctor and you have a blood test for celiac disease and it comes back negative to say that they don't think that you've got that, like I've said before, I'd still be wary of that. I'd still be careful. It could be that you go for a second opinion, and you could actually badger the doctors and say, well, yes, I know that's come back negative. However, I've got these symptoms. So I feel that I do have celiac disease, and you can request an endoscopy without actually having the blood test. Some doctors won't do it, but if you persist and you have quite a few symptoms for celiac disease, some doctors will do it. With the symptoms as well, so it's looking out for things like, are you eating something that contains gluten and you're having diarrhea? Weight fluctuations as well. So like I said earlier, I was quite skinny. In fact, it can be the opposite for people as well. They can actually put on a lot of weight. So it's just checking your weight as well, because if you've always kind of been skinny and then you get an extra symptoms, that might be a reason why. And also if you lose a lot of weight quickly as well, then that's an indicator that your gut just isn't absorbing what you need. I'd watch out for things like bloating, like I said about before. So men might actually get bloating that's more kind of internal, so you don't get that distended look of looking heavily pregnant, because obviously women are designed slightly different. So we can kind of stretch our tummies out, obviously, because we're built for childbirth and men aren't. But sometimes with bloating, it can just give almost like a full feeling, or it can actually push on your diaphragm, so you can feel a little bit breathless or a bit nauseous. So it's things like that. If you're eating gluten and you notice things like that, then it's just to be wary of that. Also kind of a feeling of just not really feeling with it, and your concentration levels being really bad. Things like headaches as well. I used to get migraines and quite bad headaches. And just generally kind of almost feeling a bit low and a bit depressed for no reason. Like I mentioned earlier, just kind of crying for no reason and just feeling, oh, okay, maybe I'm just having a bit of a down day. But if those down days are quite common and there's no real reason for it, that's something to watch out for. And like you said as well, there's other things that go hand in hand, so like osteoporosis. There's really interesting studies as well with people with Down syndrome, that they actually quite often have issues with gluten. So it's things like that. There's so many different things that can kind of go hand in hand with celiac disease or issues with gluten. So again, if you have other food intolerances, if you have skin problems, because if you think about it, as you know, Wendy, the gut is such an important place. So if that's not working properly, and you can get things like leaky gut as well, which some doctors don't actually believe in, but you know, food particles can actually leak into your gut. So then you've got toxins going around. Exactly. You know, you think of the effect that that's going to have on you.
It's painful as well. Leaky gut is very painful for people. So
absolutely, there's so much that can go wrong if your gut isn't working properly. So it's just looking out for, just listening to your body and just looking out for other signs and symptoms, really.
Brilliant.
But just to touch on it as well, because this is a really important thing, that actually you can have I can't say this word.
Asymptomatic.
Asymptomatic, thanks for the help there. Asymptomatic as well, so you don't actually have any symptoms necessarily, but you could still have celiac disease. So it's just something to consider.
Yeah, and that obviously is the most difficult time, isn't it? But thank you, that was some great tips. And yeah, you're right, you know, the gut is at the core of everything, and if your gut isn't working properly, you know, there could be so many other symptoms. And I think you know, it's really interesting that people would, you know, lots of people would associate things like bloating maybe and gut problems, but yeah, also to think about things like, you know, mood issues and depression, because you know, we make so many hormones in the gut, particularly serotonin. If your gut's not working and it's not making serotonin, which is our happy hormone, then, you know, it all makes sense, doesn't it? But it's all makes sense often retrospectively. So they were great tips that hopefully someone's listening to this and thinks, oh, actually, that might be me. Hopefully we've sort of spurred them on to get that diagnosis, and we can post them to the right places. Like I said, I'll put all the links in the show notes. I'm just going to do my very quick fire round with you before we finish. I normally ask guests this. So what food reminds you of your childhood?
What food? I would say things like lasagna. Nice and warm and hearty.
Like you go back to that pasta, isn't it? That pasta and cheese.
Yes,
pasta and cheese. Bless you. But we can do a gluten-free and a lactose-free version, can't we, of that? So
absolutely. Right. You know, the possibilities are endless with food. You can do variations of it.
And what's the most memorable meal you've ever had? In a good way, not a bad way.
The most memorable. Okay. I would say that when I was first diagnosed, I didn't have a clue where to go to eat. And I went to London to go and see The Lion King. And I wasn't feeling that great at that time, because this was quite a few years ago. And there was a fabulous restaurant inside a hotel that was right by the Lion King Theatre. And we went there, and everything within that restaurant was gluten-free, and it was just fabulous.
You can't. This has been recorded, and I'm going to put this on YouTube. But for the people who are listening from the podcast, you should have seen the joy in Anna's face. She was just like, suddenly she was like, oh, "Wow!" And you were like, honestly, you lit up. That's amazing. Is it still there? Do you know?
It is, yes.
We'll put a link to that then in the notes.
Definitely.
Your just face was an absolute picture. I could see the joy of that, discovering that food. That must have been, that was so lovely. Absolutely
it's
lovely.
Like doing cartwheels in Tesco, because there's custard creams that have come out that are gluten-free.
Oh, that's brilliant. I love it.
See, it's about staying positive, you know, when new products come out and you find new places, and it's just about embracing that and enjoying the food that you can eat.
Absolutely, and that's all about it, isn't it? Is enjoy this. But that was so lovely. And actually, you've answered my final question. So I normally ask what you're having for tea, but you've already told us. But just in case anyone missed it, what are you having for tea?
So I am having a Goodfellows pizza, which is specifically gluten-free.
Is it gluten and lactose free?
It's low in lactose.
Okay.
So to try and rebuild my lactase enzymes, I do still have a little bit of dairy now and then. Just because if you cut it out completely, I've found that that's more difficult to introduce it.
Absolutely, so, you're not feeding those enzymes, are you?
It's just about managing it and just having little bits.
Fabulous. Well, it's been an absolute joy to have you on. I hope anyone who's, you know, kind of worried about being celiac or has issues with gluten, I hope they've enjoyed that episode. I think there's lots of tips. So thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you for sharing your journey, and I'll put all the links to everything all in the show notes. And good luck with the new venture. I'm really excited about it for you.
Lovely. Thank you very much for having me. It's been lovely having a chat. And again, if anybody wants to have a chat with me or ask me any questions, I'm more than happy to speak to people.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Wendy. Bye.